I also have some academic interests in academic freedom and freedom of speech. I've been a faculty member here for almost 15 years in the School of Education. So I'm going to introduce the panel, the session, sort of let you know what our plan is. I would love to invite, we're a small group, hardy group in the snow. I'd love to invite people to move up a little closer to the front so we can have the conversation, but it's up to you. We have to use the mic because this session is being recorded so that it can be posted on our brand new, beautiful Academic Freedom website that I will encourage everyone to go to. So welcome. This is the first in a series of conversations on campus on academic freedom. The impetus for this was in part that there have been, over the past few years, a lot of very public conversations and media coverage about issues of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, especially on campus. And sometimes it feels like academic freedom is sort of rolled into those conversations, and folks may not have an understanding of what academic freedom is on campus and what are the rights and responsibilities that it confers on faculty and students. So this is the first event where we are focusing more on faculty issues. We plan to have another event in April, tentatively April 14th. Hopefully it won't be snowing, but it probably will be because I just said that. And so that one will focus on students and academic freedom in the classroom, although, of course, you know, those are artificial distinctions, and we'll be able to really talk about any of those issues tonight. All right, so we're going to start out with Provost Russ Moore. He's going to make a few remarks just about the idea for this event and the focus on campus on academic freedom. And then we have 4 amazing panelists who are going to each respond to one different question about academic freedom, and I'll introduce them in just a minute after Russ gives you an overview. So Provost Russ Moore is a distinguished scientist. He has studied alterations in the heart and whether they're brought about through exercise, heart failure, or advanced aging. As the leader of the faculty, he has been fostering important campus conversations about the future of the university and about the rights and responsibilities related to academic freedom. So please join me in welcoming Provost Moore.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the panelists for agreeing to participate in this conversation. And I want to stress that I hope this is really a rich conversation and the first of many that we hope to have during calendar year 2020 and perhaps beyond. So the intent of this panel is not to tell you what academic freedom is. It's to have a conversation about what it is. And so I'll give you a high level, what is academic freedom, but it's just to provide a little context for a conversation. I think simply stated, academic freedom is the right to pursue truth without undue external pressures, political or otherwise. Pretty simple, right? It's also a responsibility, though, to pursue the truth through disciplinary standards that are common to all of our disciplines throughout the university and throughout the academy writ large. Pretty simple. So we can leave now. But unfortunately, that's a high level what academic freedom is. But then the next question I hope we can address is who owns academic freedom? I believe academic freedom is owned by the academy and the members of the academy. The statement on academic freedom derives from most simply an AAUP statement back in the late 30s and early 40s, the work leading to the statement in 1940. It's a construct created by faculty and by members of the academy. One thing in deference to my legal counsel scholar and my faculty member from the law school, it's not a legal construct. it belongs to the faculty and it belongs to the academy. So I want to make that distinction. We can challenge that if you would like. And then finally, here's the hard question that I want us to take on, and we're not going to solve this today, or maybe we will and we'll be geniuses, is how do you practice academic freedom? You pursue the truth through your disciplinary standards and disciplinary methods. So in the research and scholarship realm, I think it's fairly simple. It's more easy to talk about it that way. But here's one that I do want to challenge us all to think about. What does the successful practice of academic freedom in the classroom look like? And I think that's something that I hope we can talk about. And let's figure this all out. So thank you very much, and I hope that we'll see you and many more of you in the panels that come this year. So thank you very much.
Okay, so let me introduce the panelists, and I'll also share the question that we asked each one specifically to respond to. Remarks will be brief. We really do want to have plenty of time for questions, conversation, sharing of different thoughts and perspectives on this issue. And I will moderate, and so I'll try my best to bring this all over. Okay, so first, our first panelist is Helen Norton. She's a professor of law here at CU Boulder. Everyone is here at CU Boulder. Her interests include constitutional law, especially free speech and issues of equality, and also civil rights law. She's a University of Colorado Presidential Teaching Scholar, and her book entitled The Government's Speech and the Constitution was recently published by Cambridge University Press. Professor Norton will respond to this question. What does the First Amendment protect and not protect, and how is that related to and different from academic freedom? Our second panelist is Sarah Fahmy. She is a PhD student and graduate part-time instructor in theater and performance studies, where she's studying cognitive development and identity formation of Middle Eastern youth in neo-colonial communities. She currently serves as the president of the United Government of Graduate Students. Thank you for doing that. Ms. Fahmy will respond to the question, what are the rights and responsibilities for students around academic freedom? Our third panelist is Alex Lloyd. He is Senior Assistant University Counsel here at CU. And before joining University Counsel, he was a staff assistant for the Senior Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer here on campus. He will focus on the question, how does academic freedom accommodate unpopular or unfounded views expressed in class? And last but definitely not least is Anand Soki. He is an associate professor of political science, and his research examines how formal and informal political conversations, interpersonal networks, and environments shape opinion formation and decision-making. He's the co-author of Politics on Display, Yard Signs, and the Politicization of Social Spaces, recently published by Oxford University Press. And he's currently serving as the director of the Keller Center for the Study of the First Amendment. Professor Soki will respond to the question, what do faculty members need to know about academic freedom as related to research and teaching? So with that, we'll start with Professor Norton.
So again, I've been asked by Michelle to talk about what the First Amendment protects and what it doesn't protect, and how that's both related to and different from academic freedom. So the field of First Amendment law, on the one hand, describes the body of constitutional law that's applied and enforced by the courts that protects speech from the government's unjustified interference. And in contrast, the field of academic freedom describes the customs and the practices that protect intellectual inquiry and debate in pursuit of the academic mission to create and disseminate knowledge, to protect that from interference by any actor, governmental or non-governmental. Now, academic freedom is, again, generally protected by professional norms and practices as embodied in the customs and the policies of any given academic community. They're not enforced or created by law. This is one of Russ's points. So while I'm a First Amendment scholar and an expert in the body of law that addresses those constitutional issues, I don't claim any special expertise in academic freedom any more than any of us on this campus, faculty or administrators, should know about academic freedom. So there's a limited but important overlap between these two sets of protections, between First Amendment protections and academic freedom protections. And this overlap is most notably in circumstances where courts recognize a close alignment between the values of academic freedom on one hand and the values of the First Amendment, such that courts draw upon academic freedom principles to inform their application of the First Amendment to government constraints. Here I'll focus on government constraints on faculty speech. Now I'm going to very briefly talk about two ways in which government restrictions on the speech of faculty members raise First Amendment issues. And as we'll see, in addressing these issues, courts sometimes, but not always, recognize an alignment between the First Amendment and academic freedom. In other words, courts are quicker to see the relationship between academic freedom and the First Amendment in some settings than in others. Okay, the first of two. First, the government sometimes constrains the speech of faculty when the government is acting as sovereign, exercising its power over its citizens. During the middle of the 20th century, for example, state and federal legislatures sometimes required loyalty oaths of faculty members, sometimes engaged in punitive investigations of faculty members' so-called subversive activities. And in a series of decisions, again from the mid-20th century, the Supreme Court found that the intellectual life of the academic community required constitutional protection from legislative interference in this way. And the court held this way because it found that academic freedom was necessary to empower the university's mission of creating and disseminating knowledge, and that mission in turn, that academic mission in turn, served multiple First Amendment values by contributing to enlightenment, discovery of truth, and by enabling and preparing citizens to participate in democratic self-governance. So in other words, in that setting, the Supreme Court found that the First Amendment and academic freedom aligned, converged, such that the First Amendment required the protection of academic freedom from the legislature's interference. Now note there that the threat to faculty speech, the threat to academic freedom there, came from the legislature. It came from a source external to the university. Here's setting two. Public universities, including but not limited to CU, are the government. And their government sometimes disciplines or otherwise restricts the speech of its faculty in its role not as sovereign, but in its role as an employer regulating the speech of its employees. So in this second setting, the constraint on faculty speech comes from within the university, from university administrators themselves. Now, the First Amendment rules that the Supreme Court applies to the government as employer regulating the speech of its employees are much more deferential, much more friendly to the government than are the rules that the court applies to the government as sovereign when it regulates the speech of its citizens more generally. In particular, in a 2006 decision called Garcetti versus Ceballos, the court held that the First Amendment does not protect public employees' speech pursuant to their official duties. Basically said that public employers have bought their employees' speech with a salary, and thus they own it, they control it. In that case, the court rejected a First Amendment challenge by a prosecutor who had been disciplined by his public employer for his internal memo that criticized the police department, charged the police department with misrepresenting the facts in various affidavits trying to get search warrants. In their divided court, a 5-4 court held, quote, "When public employees make statements pursuant to their official duties, the employees are not speaking as citizens for First Amendment purposes, and the Constitution does not insulate their communications from employer discipline." In other words, the Constitution does not protect their speech as a public employee. So the majority created this bright line rule that treats public employees' speech pursuant to their official duties as speech that the government may restrain and punish without raising any First Amendment problem. So this is a hugely significant cutback on the rights of public employees in general to express themselves, and perhaps more important, it's a hugely significant reduction in the public's access to the views and the information of public employees who can shed light on how government is actually working. Now, in this decision, however, the court expressly declined to deal with the question of whether or not public university faculty are sufficiently different such that there should be special rules. The court declined to say whether or not it would apply this very bright line, employer-friendly, speech-unfriendly rule to the speech of public university faculty. Quote, there is some argument that expression related to academic scholarship or classroom instruction implicates additional constitutional interests that are not fully accounted for by this court's customary employee speech jurisprudence. We need not, and for that reason do not, decide whether the analysis we conduct today, no First Amendment protection for public employee speech, would apply in the same manner to a case involving speech related to scholarship or teaching. So the court has yet to return to this question nearly 15 years later. In the meantime, lower courts struggle with these questions, and they reach mixed results as to whether or not the First Amendment protects the speech of public university faculty in their research, in their teaching, and in their governance activities. Now, if the court ultimately decides to apply this employer-friendly, speech-unfriendly rule to faculty at public universities, that would effectively eliminate First Amendment protection for public universities' faculty speech on research, in teaching, and in governance. But even if the court were to do that, and that would be very significant, even if the court were to do that, however, this is the good news, principles of academic freedom, which don't rely on the Constitution, which don't rely on the courts, either for their genesis or for their enforcement, would still provide an independent source of protection, which is one of many reasons why the conversation we're having today is so important.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Speaking about academic freedom, for me, is possibly one of the most exciting things that I actually enjoy talking about. Simply because, to me, in my eyes, academic freedom is the essence of higher education. Russ explained how it belongs to the academy, it belongs to the faculty. It also belongs to students. Academic freedom, we can't really have academic freedom on a campus if we are not engaging in it in the classroom. I say that it's the essence for any campus because we are trying to create students who can become the leaders of tomorrow. We're trying to create people who can think in an intellectual manner. We are trying to create students who can have opinions about things and share them and discuss them without getting into heated arguments, without backing them up with actual facts. It is our duty in the classroom to have these conversations. And something that's really important to remember is that on a public university campus, on a campus that is as big as CU Boulder, oftentimes we don't know who is sitting in the classroom. We have no idea where these students are coming from. We have no idea where the faculty or the instructors are coming from. We have such diverse backgrounds represented, and whether that is race, ethnicity, nationality, gender identity, sexuality, or even socioeconomic status. There is such a wide variety of people who are present in any given room at a time, and it is our duty to cultivate these conversations in classrooms. It is the rights for students to be able to have a safe space where they feel like they are comfortable enough to express their opinions. And I use the term safe space very loosely for this example, because a safe space needs to be inclusive to include everyone with their different beliefs. So it's not about what my beliefs are as an instructor, or what my beliefs are as like the loudest student in the room to voice these opinions. It is listening to the people with opposing thoughts, even if they go against my own. And it's the rights of students to sit there and be able to have a space that they feel included without accidentally feeling excluded because we are presenting a perspective that they don't necessarily align with or that goes against their own personal narrative. It is also the rights of students to be able to engage in these conversations. A lot of times for our undergrads, who are especially freshmen, this is the first time they have moved away from home, or this is the first time that they are engaging in conversations as adults, as people who will then be able to become future leaders, people who will become employed in a wide variety of fields and industries all around the world. But then also for our graduate students, in their capacity as students, this is often a place, the university is a place where they can explore different research ideas. They can explore different perspectives that they have not previously been able to explore. And creating these environments within the classroom enables us to go beyond the immediate idea of what we think of or challenging our own belief system. So it's not necessarily just challenging what everyone else thinks, but it's also the ability to listen to other people's perspectives and take that into consideration. Academic freedom is also really important in terms of creating critical discourse around any given subject. I'm in the humanities, so it's something that we rely on really heavily, but I also would argue that it's something that is very important in the sciences as well. Academic freedom is not regulated to one discipline or another. It is a state of mind. It is how we engage in our teaching strategies. It is how we becoming inclusive, including inclusive pedagogy, universal design ideas. It is the idea that we can deconstruct or dismantle these structures of knowledge of who is in control of the conversation. We often have a culture where the professor is the only one that is allowed to voice a perspective or generate the facts. But in order to dismantle this, in order to have students who we can then rely on to being successful leaders in the future, we need to be able to critically engage them. We need to be able to have conversations with students where they can comfortably challenge the instructor's perspectives. Not in an argumentative manner, not in saying that the instructor or the faculty member doesn't have knowledge about any given subject matter. But it's really, academic freedom is really important to being able to generate different conversations about any particular point of view. That being said, it is also our responsibilities as students to respect one another and to be able to listen with an open mind to people with different opinions. It is the ability to take in a different perspective, but also to think about your own perspective in a different light, and to be able to create a thesis almost, or an argument, and support it with actual facts. We often find ourselves in this, especially in today's society, where we are becoming more and more involved with technology, where we are hiding behind our screens, where we are incapable of having actual conversations about controversial socioeconomic, political topics in public, because we are not having any spaces to actually safely discuss them without fear of harm or repercussion. And it is a problem. It is a thing that we need to be able to cultivate within the academy in order to be able to have it outside of the academy as well. It is not only a conversation that I think should be happening in classrooms, but I think that classrooms are a great way to be able to foster that narrative and to be able to have these conversations. So students are responsible for this, faculty are responsible for this, staff members are responsible. Everyone has a responsibility to also recognize their own privilege with what they're saying, when they're saying it, and what they're able to voice a perspective about. But again, I think academic freedom is the essence of this university. It goes exactly to everything that we talk about, whether it's the idea plan, whether it's academic futures, and it's all of these things about how do we create a successful leader for the future who is able to have multiple conversations about any given topic with a different audience. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you all for coming here on a cold, snowy night, and thanks to Russ and Michelle for putting this together. As they alluded to, academic freedom lends itself to a conversation series. As you heard Russ say, it doesn't lend itself to an easy, quippy definition. It's going to come up in multifaceted, factual situations. They're going to require multifaceted, fact-specific responses. I kind of wanted to do some throat clearing on that because an ongoing conversation series makes a lot of sense. It's going to get this conversation going. The question I had was, how does academic freedom accommodate unpopular or unfounded views expressed in class? When I thought about that question, I thought this would be primarily a faculty audience, so the response would come from that faculty perspective. And I thought, what am I going to tell faculty about how to teach their class? I mean, that's what they do. They're the experts in that. I'm a lawyer. I can't tell them how to teach their class. But then I thought that's kind of an elegant segue into the legal principle that I think relates to this question, which is when it comes to inside the classroom, teaching, activity, course of discussion, assignments, faculty are the captain of the ship. That may be a silly analogy, but that thread finds its way through the law. There is significant deference in the courts and from judges and in court opinions that faculty and institutions and universities get to direct the curriculum, get to direct assignments, get to direct their own speech in those contexts. That does not mean that unfounded or unpopular views cannot be expressed. It doesn't mean that. But I do think it's important to remember that as faculty, when you're teaching a course, you get to direct the academic nature of that course. To use court language on it, it's your legitimate pedagogical decision-making as to what happens in class, as to the assignments, as to grades. There are some significant caveats that come with that, which I'll get to those in a second. But I didn't want to lose sight of that. When it comes to how does academic freedom accommodate unpopular or unfounded views expressed in class, it accommodates them up to a point. If you're teaching a class about mathematics and a student only wants to talk about the 2020 political election for 15 minutes each class, you are allowed to say, this class is for mathematics, this class is for physics. You can drive it back to on-topic discussions. As we've talked about, one thing you'll also see in the law, sort of a cliched perspective, is the university is the marketplace of ideas. And it is. It's cliched because it's often quoted, but we are that. We want to challenge ourselves. That's what I think of when I think of academic freedom. Again, as that's not necessarily a legal concept, but I think we're here to debate, to discuss, to challenge each other. Unpopular views are a critical aspect of that. I kind of like that in this panel on this topic, we get to stand up for free speech and academic freedom and for these robust discussions. It's gonna incorporate uncomfortable, unpopular ideas. Now, I do think there's a critical distinction between unfounded views versus unpopular views. I don't think there's nearly as much tolerance for unfounded views in the classroom. I have a distinct memory. I was a history major. I focused on Eastern European history. I took a class called the Holocaust. The very first thing the faculty member said is, we're going to learn about the Holocaust. We're not going to learn about Holocaust denial. We're not going to talk about it. There will be no questions on it. You might think, well, academic freedom, we should challenge each other. We should have those views. We didn't in that class. And I think the faculty member fully within their rights to be the captain of the ship on that point. So that's perhaps an exaggerated example because it seems clear enough that we wouldn't have to talk about Holocaust denial. But it underscores this point. Faculty get to control the course of discussion. There is tons of legal terminology that you could apply here. It's school-sponsored speech. That's our speech. We get to control it. If you want to learn more about all that stuff, you'll probably have to take Professor Norton's class. It gets somewhat complicated. Unpopular views, different. That, to me, gets more to classical academic freedom. It goes back to the marketplace of ideas concept. We should be allowed to challenge each other in class up to a point. If it becomes disruptive, if it takes you off the progress of your course, you are allowed to redirect it back. Caveats, two important ones, and I think they relate to university policy. 2 years ago, in 2018, the regents passed policy 7C. So that's regent policy. That's about as high as a policy we can have at the university, higher than our campus policies. It was new, and I want to read one aspect of it because it comments on student academic freedom in class. During a class discussion, students shall be free to raise questions and express reasoned opinions on the current subject, provided that students follow applicable campus policies and reasonable procedures established by the instructor to ensure orderly discussion and progress toward class and course goals. So I think a lot of what I'm talking about is getting at that. You can raise questions. We're supposed to challenge each other as long as you remain orderly, as long as you allow the class to continue to progress. And as faculty, you have the right to move it in that direction. One other caveat. The discrimination and harassment policy. It's enforced by the Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. It prevents adverse action from being taken against any of us, faculty, staff, students, based on our protected classes or characteristics. What might those be? Political affiliation, religious affiliation. So while you are allowed to be the captain of the ship in your class, there becomes a line between, if you had to kick somebody out of class for disruption, they might say, I think it's because I was talking about my political views. If I'm you, if I'm the faculty member, I want to make sure that I can defend myself on the fact that, no, it had to do with the legitimate pedagogy of this course and progress in that course. But I list out those policies. They're important considerations when you have unpopular, unfounded views being expressed in a classroom. That's it.
Thanks, everybody, for being here and braving the weather. And thanks to my fellow panelists. Thanks to Michelle and Russ for putting this together. I think it's a great time for this kind of a conversation. And I think that because you're here, you probably do as well. So I want to give one definition of academic freedom. And it's kind of a riff off of things you'll see on CU's website and other places as well. And I want to do that for a reason, because I'm going to push us on that definition, and maybe we'll kind of work through that as well in the kind of the Q&A. So one definition of academic freedom is the freedom to inquire, discover, access, publish, disseminate, and teach truth, and other people have mentioned the word truth, okay, as the individual understands it, subject to no control or authority save the control and authority of the rational methods by which knowledge is established in the field. Okay, so there's a definition, but as others have said, the definition is open to interpretation and debate. And there are kind of key parts of that that I think about quite a bit. Rational methods, right? What do we consider to be rational methods? Truth as the individual understands it, okay? Also, another thing that we need to be thinking about. So if that's a definition, we'll take that for a second. What does that mean? It means that we're not, as faculty members, okay, and I was kind of asked to comment on what we as faculty should know about academic freedom, all right? So what are kind of the 2 or 3 things, you should be keeping in mind? All right, well, so you're not supposed to be pressured directly or indirectly, right, with respect to your work, right? You're not supposed to be able to be kind of coerced into suppressing or changing the work that you do as it pertains to your academic mission, okay? You should also know, right, in terms of things you should keep in mind. So you have these protections, and Alex kind of mentioned these, and other people have mentioned these, and there are processes that are in place if you feel like your rights in this respect have been violated. That's spelled out in Policy 5H, which is something you should check out, the Faculty Senate Committee on Privilege and Tenure. And so that is the place that you would go, right? Something you should know as a faculty member if you were to feel like you had an issue with this. But the thing that I really wanted to focus on, and other people have mentioned here, is because I've given a definition, and I say, what does that mean? Okay, it means you're protected. And so that's very much a me kind of approach to this. It's very individual, but I'd like to move us from me to we. And the thing about academic freedom and working in academia more generally is that we oftentimes think about this as a very individual enterprise. And in some ways it is, right? We have that image of ourselves in our offices or in our labs, kind of doing our own thing. that's when we're at our best. But so much of what we do is about the we. So much of what we do is about interpersonal relations, about the classroom experience, about the communication of science and other things that we produce, right? So I think that it's important, and it may not strike you as surprising that the political science guy is going to draw a governmental or a polity kind of metaphor here, right? But I think that something that Michelle, Russ, and my fellow panelists have mentioned is that idea of responsibility is something that I think we need to take much more seriously than a lot of us do. It's not just about your protections, your rights. Yeah, okay. But actually, we're all in this together. And so what does responsibility mean, and what does it mean with respect to that definition, which is one of several possible definitions, and pieces of which can certainly be debatable? Well, it means at base that you have a responsibility to maintain competence, okay? And that's language that you see talked about in different places. But I think that, right, and so that's kind of taking care of yourself, but it also means that you have a responsibility to kind of work in terms of shared governance when it comes to academe. So we are all kind of responsible together for, this construct of academic freedom. And that means thinking about the ways in which we provide it in our classes, the ways in which we kind of actually undertake it in our jobs. And I think that it also means, right, taking steps to ensure that we are kind of like checking against our own biases, whatever they might be. So just kind of as an example of this, right, you should familiarize yourself with CU policy. You should read, as other people have mentioned, the AAU, kind of bullet points on academic freedom. And there's a lot of kind of Q&As on AAU's website that I think are very useful. But I think that other things to kind of keep in mind here are, with respect to like your teaching and your evaluation, are, okay, if you're providing a classroom environment where there's some sense of viewpoint neutrality, when it comes to the assessment side, we can't completely remove ourselves from our biases. Our affect, our like or dislike of people and ideas is a real thing, and it's a sticky thing, all right? And I think many of us in here probably read enough political psychology to know that it influences your reasoning. Motivated reasoning is a real thing. So what are things that we can do to ensure that we are actually evaluating fairly while we've embraced the unpopular opinion and people kind of actively kind of arguing against us or maybe disagreeing with our ideas, right, in a proper context? Well, one of those things that we can do is we can think about mechanisms that we can put in place for evaluating our students, right? So we might want to grade as blindly as possible. Okay, that's just one example. And a parallel that I like to draw here is if you think about like FCQs, which everybody loves, right? And nothing controversial about FCQs at all. And we know this, right? This growing body of research about all of the problems with FCQs. And they are not supposed to be, right, the only metric by which we judge and evaluate each other's competence, okay? But in the same way, right, while we run our classes and we are responsible for doing that, we might want to think about ways in which we can evaluate our students and check against those biases that we might have because, yeah, we let them talk, but we didn't really love that opinion, right? Or we really didn't love the fact that they were challenging that theory that I presented. And we need to remember that because that can still kind of creep in when you're reading their paper later, even if you're saying to yourself, okay, I'm being careful about this, all right? So thinking about some mechanisms you can put in place in your classes for evaluation, taking copious notes on things like participation, if you put those kinds of points as part of a syllabus, right, in class discussion, actually have a record. Hold yourself accountable to those things rather than, simply kind of like leaving that to the end and then having it be an impression-driven thing. Because that's another place where biases can creep in if that student said something that you didn't enjoy or like, right? Even if it was the proper expression of it, right? So those are a couple of things. The last things that I would just kind of like to say in terms of what are things that faculty should know, right? So when I talk to people about it, one is, yeah, I think we need to move from me to we. We need to think about our collective responsibility in kind of upholding this construct and working for it. And that means, all right, holding ourselves and holding each other accountable. The other thing is that, and I think this is probably an obvious point to many people in here, but academic freedom does not mean you can't be fired. Academic freedom does not mean, right, that you can put kind of, crappy research out there in the world. That's not what it is, right? Academic freedom means that you're doing your job well and that nothing is going to tell you, right, interfere with that process of discovering truth, right? So if you come up with the result, if you report something, in fact, people would argue that it's your ethical responsibility to report that truth directly, not to suppress it, okay? Just kind of a quick example to kind of put a point on this. Some of us work in public opinion and polling, and I run one of our polls that we do here at the university, the Political Climate Survey of Colorado. We do it yearly. And sometimes there is public opinion, data that comes back in that people don't really want to hear, okay? As you might imagine, in this kind of lovely political climate we're in right now. And we get pushback on that, right? Whether it's because our data show that a particular public official is or isn't popular at the time, right? Or whether it's about whether or not a particular measure is going to pass or something like that. But academic freedom, just as one example, means putting those things out there in the world because they are what they are, okay? Not because people are going to like or dislike them. So I'll stop there and we can get on to some questions here.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. I think they've given us a lot of things to think about and hopefully talk about. So with that, I want to open it up to comments, questions, ways to get the conversation started. And I'll run over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. My question is, what do you do about a situation in which you have an external agency, or represented by a person, of course, who is trying to monitor what you're saying in class and has every intention of reporting that to this external agency? I assume that's an infringement on our academic freedom, but what are you going to do about it, right? The practical question.
Should have worn my sneakers. Someone?
I hope that we all take a crack at this. The external agency is not a government agency. It's a private nonprofit. Well, the reason I ask that question is that if it's the government, then we might also have First Amendment issues, right? To the extent that a government is interfering with your speech, interfering with your academic freedom. And if it's a private agency, there's not a First Amendment issue, right? So take another example. If you're at a private school, if you're at Yale, if you're at Denver University, if they discipline, if they restrict their faculty in any way, there's no First Amendment issue. Private actors can't violate the First Amendment. There's a significant academic freedom issue. So let's just assume that your external monitor is a private agency. So the only available protections would be academic freedom protections. So then we'd all want to know more about the nature of their monitoring and the nature of the interference, right? Are they disruptive? Are they changing? Is there a way that are they changing the way that you are teaching? right? Are they interfering with the way that you're teaching or presenting your research? You know, to the extent that they are in some ways, then we seem to have a threat to academic freedom. And I can imagine some situations where a monitor would in fact have a chilling effect, and I could see some situations where monitors might be seen as having transparency effects. So all the fighting is going to be over what is the effect of this presence on your teaching, on your speech, on your research. And if it's interfering it, right, if it's pushing you away from exploring the things that you want to explore, talking about the things that you want to talk about, it is a threat to academic freedom. Then what we do about it is what we do about it as a community, right? Academic freedom is protected not by the law, but by our customs and practices and norms. So we, that's the we that Anand is talking about, have a role in deciding that.
I think that one of the most important things is to go back and look at the syllabus. Oftentimes talking about academic freedom or why are you discussing these controversial conversations in the first place? Or why are you discussing problematic issues and how does that relate to anything? And oftentimes it's like, well, you're tying it back to the actual material that you're studying or looking back at that statement that is in the syllabus about what are the objectives of this class? What are you here to do? What are you looking at? What is the reading list? Because oftentimes that is all written out, and in order to have these conversations about these different topics and actually discuss them at the depth that's required of them, you have to do that. And if people come out and say that that is an infringement of a First Amendment, or if it's a conversation about like your academic freedom and how it's not acceptable to be discussing these issues, then I would say that you always have that syllabus to back you up. And we've also got multiple policies and statements that we have to put in our syllabi about protecting the different protected classes on campus and respecting different people's opinions. And in different departments, we're also encouraged to have a disclaimer statement about we will be discussing issues about these topics. Please bear in mind that it might present issues that are uncomfortable. So do strange conversations happen? They definitely do. I mean, I teach, just to give an example, I teach an American musical history class, musical theater. And one of the first things that we discuss in the very first week of class is minstrelsy and blackface. And it is a very, very tough topic to discuss. And it shows a lot of racist background and a lot of racist history. And the only reason that we can talk about the subject of minstrelsy in that class is because of the historical context. And it's problematic, but going back to that syllabus statement and going back to the objectives of the course of we are teaching the evolution of musical theater and looking at what it does, that is where it would come in place to protect instructors and students from that kind of backlash.
So I think Sarah and Helen nailed a lot of the substantive issues. One practical piece of advice is, not to suffer in silence. If you think something wrong is taking place, to raise it up the flagpole, so to speak, whether it's to a chair or divisional dean, or eventually to Russ and Michelle, and it becomes their problem. But hopefully, but I do think I end a lot of conversations in the course of my day with, have you spoken to your upline about this? They may have some pearls of wisdom, or they may know where some other resource is on campus. A thing not to forget is this university has a ton of resources out there. You might even be surprised at what they are. Again, the particular issue you mentioned is an interesting one. I'm not sure exactly where you might go, depending on the facts and circumstances, but you might raise it up the flagpole a little bit.
I'll kind of echo that I think that my fellow panelists have covered it pretty well. But the only additional thing I was thinking about with your question was, and I had an issue with this actually, I think it was when I was teaching a very big intro to US Gov, like 400 plus students, during the 2016 election. So that was an easy class, as you might imagine. But I had students that were doing unauthorized recordings. And the part of the monitoring that made me think about this is that when I ran this up, that eventually was taken care of because there is an intellectual property issue, right, with instruction and what you do. And you see examples of this crop up it seems like on a cycle, like every 4 or 5 years. There's some like Buffs Notes knockoff that is trying to sell course materials or unauthorized recordings of people's work in a lot of big introductory classes. And that has to get shut down, right? And so that was something that you might want to also be kind of thinking about too. If you're being recorded without your permission, raise it to legal, because there could be those other issues involved as well, aside from what it can do to the way that you feel your academic freedom, right, is kind of playing out. So.
Yeah. One quick point, because I think Anand's exactly right about that, is sort of surreptitious recordings. We're a one-party consent state, which means you're technically allowed to do it. You're allowed to record without someone knowing. It's legal. But that doesn't mean we can't have a policy against it in your department or in your syllabus. You are not allowed to record me without my permission. You're allowed to have that kind of policy.
Yeah, and I have that policy in my syllabus, no electronic devices other than laptops, and laptops only for classroom purposes. But it sounds like William is describing somebody who is not a student. Is that right? Yeah. I mean, do we have or can we have policies that students only in classes?
Certainly, and I think that's department to department. Sometimes there's departments that have where you can, you're taking the class for non-credit purposes, that kind of thing. But we absolutely get to control who's present in the classroom. Raises some free speech issues, right? The classroom is not a public forum for everyone to come in and take your class for free. It's not a money thing necessarily, but that's part of it. It's not a public forum. It's a non-public forum. Form analysis, super complicated First Amendment thing, but it's a non-public forum. Not everybody gets to attend.
Thank you. Other questions?
While you were talking about, excuse me, while you were talking about the rights afforded to faculty in the classroom to be captain of the classroom, I was wondering whether graduate students who are classroom leaders have those same rights.
So, yes, I think that it kind of goes back to my original statement about who is disseminating the knowledge. I think that the faculty or the instructor is definitely in charge of controlling that conversation, kind of facilitating the discussion, if you will. I try and avoid thinking of it as this is the one person that's in charge, because then it makes it seem like we're trying to change your opinions based on my opinions, which I don't think is what was thought of with like the captain of the ship idea. But I think that it's really important to look back at how, especially with graduate student instructors, as their double role as both students and as instructors, but in that specific moment when they're teaching, of having that authority and how do they present themselves and how do they manage to navigate that conversation. It's really difficult for different graduate student instructors with different backgrounds to maintain that authority in the room. And so sometimes it's really difficult to impose that on graduate students of you must be able to have these tough conversations when we're not training graduate students to have these tough conversations. It kind of goes back to an idea of pedagogical skills and how are we supporting that or how are we enforcing that. But ultimately, I think that graduate student instructors are also capable of being the captain of the ship and of being able to have that.
I agree they're capable. I'm just wondering if they're afforded the same protection by the university.
I think that they definitely are. It's I know in my department we definitely are. It goes back to looking at the hierarchy of the university, of that if anything happens to you in the classroom, you've got a GTP lead that you go to, who is now under the CTL. And then you've got your faculty advisor, or you've got your department chair, and then it keeps going up. You've also got multiple avenues for reporting different incidents, whether it's OIC, whether it's Odyssey, there are multiple avenues to be able to speak up about problematic issues and just asking for advice on how do you respond to issues.
I think that I was going to ask if that is that what you meant?
Yeah,
So, like, a recitation. They afforded those same protections. I thought that's what you were kind of maybe getting at, and then I was going to ask Alex.
Yeah, I was gonna say I will respond to it on like a academic level, not a region level. That is, yeah, that's an Alex question.
And I can't spit out the lyric, song, and verse from the Regent law or policy, but my answer instinctually will be yes, they're afforded those protections. Yes, they are. And I also believe that the law would look at it the exact same way. And that's where I was coming from earlier, which is the law, these external bodies accord significant deference to the legitimate pedagogical decisions of the academy, all up, down, and through it. So it's not that, someone's a tenured faculty so that they're afforded the most deference by the courts. No, the courts are going to look at it all, up and down. We get to decide within our academic freedom what we're teaching, classroom conduct, et cetera. I see no reasonable distinction for instructors, lecturers, graduate student teachers. I believe they all have that kind of academic freedom. Again, we'd want to go back and check Article 5 or Regent Law 5. And if you're interested, great things to read, or if you can't sleep, great things to read.
So I think that's a helpful, helps remind us of the distinction between academic freedom, which is protected not by the law, but by our own community norms, practices, and customs, and the law. Academic freedom as a principle, right, shouldn't be at all tied to seniority or tenure status or job title, right? It should be tied to the function of whether or not you're engaged in intellectual inquiry that takes the form of research, teaching, or governance activities. And a robust academic freedom policy community set of norms would recognize that. To the extent that courts are enforcing, as a matter of contract law, things like the Regent rules, then they certainly will defer to our robust understanding of academic freedom if we have it. To the extent that courts are looking at it from a First Amendment perspective, I think they really struggle with that notion, and that they're more likely to be quite hierarchical and limited in their views.
Okay, yeah.
Hi there, Elena Beaver from Odyssey. Thank you all so much for being on the panel tonight. So I want to bring up two things, and for just the sake of time, I'm going to bring them both up at the same time, but we can talk about one or the other. I think what our most recent conversation around the rights of graduate students speaks to a broader question of awareness, and I loved your point about going from the I to the we. I do think that academic freedom does carry an implicit serious responsibility, but I think there's an awareness problem, and whether or not our required syllabus statements are enough and currently under the way that they're written convey the protections that really adequately inform everyone who is in an educational leadership position in a classroom, whether they feel that they are aware and are fully informed of their rights and responsibilities under academic freedom. That is a question that is maybe worth exploring, and part of, what is the awareness campaign to help people fully understand academic freedom and where their rights and responsibilities lie, to be able to insert themselves into a tense situation in a classroom and redirect from a volatile situation that's off topic, right? These kinds of things come up in workshops around inclusive pedagogy, which I've led on this campus for 3 years now under a series that Odyssey has provided, and now in partnership with the Center for Teaching and Learning. We have a new inclusive pedagogy lead on campus who is going to be providing significant leadership on this topic. And there's intersection here. And several of you mentioned inclusion, and I think it's so my challenge is for us to tease apart academic freedom a little bit and to actually think about where it intersects with inclusive excellence, and to maybe move towards academic freedom not as a concept that is defined or a static sort of what is, but how do we empower individuals to take action with academic freedom? And how do we move to a place of true inclusive excellence where people feel that they are existing in a place of academic liberation?
Next time, though, you have to start at that end. Well, I like the question for a lot of reasons, but in part, I mean, I think that we have to, in this discussion, we have to resist the inclination to pretend that hard questions are easy. And I think that you're hitting on some hard questions that ideally we want to craft this so that the notion of academic freedom is aligned with inclusiveness. But it's not hard for us to imagine some tensions, right? And this is a matter not only of academic freedom, but actually surviving as a democracy. We have to find a way to talk with people with whom we fiercely disagree, right? So intellectual inquiry and debate is part of doing that. And part of intellectual inquiry and debate is empowering, among other things, intellectual courage, which means not only the courage to share your own views, but the courage to wrestle with the views of others that you find troubling, unsettling, unorthodox, dangerous. Can you do all that in a respectful way? And can we agree about what respect and inclusiveness mean? I think those are the really hard questions, and it sounds like you are engaging them in your own daily work and awareness, and thank you for that. But I think I want to say, yes, inclusion and academic freedom are completely aligned, and I think it is more complicated than that.
I agree with that. I think that it's an issue of not only willingness to engage in the conversation, but also an issue of time and ability and capacity to learn about these issues. It's something that we need to integrate on all different levels within our campus. It's allocating time to discussing these issues and receiving adequate training and having it being built in with whether it's students, staff, or faculty at multiple levels. It's also an issue of we might have some resources, but it's also about access, transparency, and accessibility to these resources. And how do we know about them? Do we know about them when it's too late? Are we reacting to the disaster once it happens, or are we trying to take action before that and thinking ahead? Thinking about empowering individuals and how they can react to this, or how they can safely voice their differing opinions in an academic setting. It's also about teaching us how to navigate these conversations and knowing what is academic freedom versus what isn't, and then how do we even define it? Can you have your first year student define what academic freedom is and when to use it and how to? And even taking it all the way up to faculty, is that something that's possible? So just going back to the basics, thinking as a collective of how we can get to every single person on this campus.
Yep, I think those are fantastic responses to a very difficult question. In terms of awareness of it, it's part of why I think this, if it weren't so snowy out, there'd be more people getting awareness of it right now. That's part of what this conversation's about. And in terms of the clash between academic freedom or free speech and inclusivity, that one has not been, we haven't written the end on that one yet. It is open. As you know, being on this campus, we have controversial speakers come on campus. They don't sound very inclusive sometimes. they have a free speech right just as anybody else does to take the podium. So those concepts clash. We won't solve that in this session today. It's a very important question to consider, though.
I agree with my fellow panelists, but the only other angle I'd add on it is that when I started my comments and I mentioned truth, I think it's really important to remember that truth is an evolving thing, right? And that doesn't mean to say that we can't, try to approximate it, right? But it's our understanding of what truth is always changing, right? And in what we do, right? And so one angle that I kind of take to this, and that I kind of take to dealing with difficult conversation in the classroom and kind of a just broad approach, is I think a lot of freedom comes in being able to say, I don't know. A lot of freedom comes in being able to embrace uncertainty. I think, and being comfortable with uncertainty and kind of teaching students to understand how we use uncertainty in academe, right? But it doesn't mean that the door is closed, right? It just means that we kind of, we have the difficult conversation, we evaluate the evidence, we scrutinize the argument, but it doesn't mean that we're going to walk out of there saying, this is the answer, and we're all satisfied with that outcome. And that's just kind of a general orientation to this. It's an evolving thing, just like our understanding of academic freedom is an evolving thing. And I think that if, you kind of try to communicate that in classes, I think it can be effective. The other thing I would say to your point about kind of getting the word out about an awareness is I would challenge people in here to have a conversation with a colleague about it. I'm a person who studies deliberative and informal contexts, and that's an exercise that I oftentimes will do, is I will say, go out and talk to 3 to 5 people in a focused way about this topic, right? And then report back, And I think that that's a good thing for us to do, right, with each other, with these kinds of things, is to say, hey, have you thought about this issue at all? Or how are you, these are the kinds of things that you have 5 minutes before a seminar and you're getting to catch up with people. Start something like that, because that can be a good way to kind of keep that conversation going later.
Thanks. I'm going to take the mic holder's prerogative and just add one comment to that, because I think that something related to academic freedom that is not often discussed, right, has to do, yes, with truth, but what Russ also talked about related to disciplinary standards, and this connects a little bit with the captain of the classroom. And that is that there, while truth, yes, changes and evolves, right, as we learn more, we do know some things, right? And so in our disciplines, right, that we have expertise, and there are sort of evidence, research-based data, opinions, et cetera, right? And so faculty can rely on that in classrooms when perhaps perspectives are being brought up that are exclusionary and potentially untrue or unfounded, right? And so there is this sense that academic freedom can help us as teachers, right, limit not, in huge ways, right, but limit things that are being said that are not founded, that are not based on evidence, right? That we don't have good research supporting. And I think Alex's example, yes, an extreme example, right? But the course on the Holocaust and the professor that said, we're not going to talk about Holocaust denial. That's an inclusionary move, right? An inclusive move. So anyway.
Hi, I don't know if you can all see me. I'll scoot. Sorry, I'm wondering about what we're supposed to do in an instance in which knowledge production in these spaces is like historically and culturally biased, and what we do when students who are bringing attention to those things are coded as like being off topic or disruptive?
Great question.
I think that's a great question. And so one of the things that I try to do is to, if we are in the middle of something else and a student is raising that point, I move to embrace it, right? And say, you know what? We're actually trying to get through this material, but let's carve out time either in the last 15 minutes to come back to this, or let's designate Thursday session to talk about this or something like that. So one move that I make is letting people know that those are valid opinions, things to bring up, especially right when they're being expressed in a polite, respectful, appropriate way. That is what we are supposed to be doing with academic freedom, is allowing ourselves to be challenged, right? And allowing, right, our intellectual traditions and our pedagogical approaches to be challenged. So if sometimes it can feel disruptive, and so that might be what you're kind of talking about when students are told not to say that stuff. So I try to be cognizant of that and say, okay, I'm going to, I want to take this seriously. I want to give time to it, but we need to get through regression analysis, right? I need to teach this today. So after we've taught, about error in models, we can come back to this conversation about like quantitative research traditions and the Western canon and things like that. This is all to a broader kind of point that I was going to make in response to several people's comments and questions that, and something Michelle just said that I think is very useful, is setting the boundaries of the conversation or debate, or however you want to put it, time and time again when you walk into the classroom. I think that's a really useful thing, is to say, this is what we're focused on today. This is how we're going to approach it. And doing that at the outset, not only do students tend to like that because it helps them to keep an organized kind of, a set of notes and questions about that kind of experience that day, but I think it's also a useful thing because it can kind of let them know that you take other things seriously, but you're also trying to get through other material. But that idea of setting the boundaries consistently is, I think, a good thing. In political science, where we never talk about anything controversial at all, there are days when I have to walk in and say, okay, today we're gonna assume that democracy is a good thing. We're gonna assume that the American Constitution is what we're gonna work off of as a basis for evaluating, this data set or something like that, right? It might be about public opinion towards, free expression, something like that. I tend to teach a lot of kind of interactive quantitative data classes. But the point is that, I kind of try to set the boundaries and reset them. And in doing that, I think it can let students know that you're serious about what they have to say and the challenges that they have to a variety of things on your syllabus and elsewhere, but that you're also trying to kind of get done what you want to get done. I think it's a way of trying to be sincere, to be reactive, but and to avoid coming across as dismissive.
And in addition to that, it's a fully legally defensible way to go about it as well. I realize I'm speaking from the legal perspective and not the teaching perspective, but if someone accused me of not listening or discrimination or not letting people express their views, and I had to, let's say I was the lawyer for that person, like Anand, I would say, well, all they were doing was trying to keep the course on track. We're talking about this today. We're setting out a little bit of a roadmap to get through the material I've set out for us to get through. That is high ground for faculty to direct the course.
Yeah, I will agree with that and add on to it that it's also important to, especially when we're looking at history and historical facts and really problematic historical facts that students might be bringing up or that we might be discussing in class in general, is going back and realizing that we are looking at it from a very contemporary lens and from our perspective today, because we weren't alive at that time. But also looking at it from another perspective of this is the history that we are teaching right now because we are teaching a very Western canon. And I think that it's important to acknowledge the pitfalls or the areas that might still need working on. Or if we're teaching something that's controversial, it's having the conversation of, well, why are we teaching it from this perspective? And acknowledging that it can be challenged and that it is problematic and that this is the history that we're teaching, because how is history written and who writes it and who's it for? But also if students are bringing up issues that are disruptive to the actual conversation and the topic of the class, I think that it's perfectly valid for an instructor to steer that conversation back, but also to simply mention that they acknowledge and they hear the remarks of that student, because again, respecting where all these students are coming from and from their own personal experiences and their diverse backgrounds, and just keeping in mind that people have different reasons for why they bring things up. We might not personally align with them, but it's kind of steering it back to the conversation of, okay, how does this point that you bring up relate back to this topic that we just addressed? And always trying to navigate it back to the exact content of the class. So even if it is really problematic and not a favorable comment whatsoever, that's part of academic freedom, of challenging us to think about these positions that are accepted as the norm and that are accepted as this is the right way of thinking in particular societies or particular time periods.
Thank you. Those were all very thoughtful. And I'll just add to that, to add to the challenge, I think that it's really hard in the middle of teaching a class to figure out what's disruptive and what's really productive on the fly. And I find myself, if you've familiar with the term shower cringe, you're taking a shower and I'm thinking, oh, wow, I let that conversation go way too long. Or more troubling to me, I cut that off way too quickly, and that was headed someplace productive. And when I feel that way, I come back the next class and say that. I say, I wish I had made a different choice. And this is what I would like to say about it, and this is what I would like invite other folks to weigh in on as well.
And to add to that, I think that there's great power in being able to say, actually, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, or can we pause this and just look back at it and come back to this conversation. And so as a faculty member or as an instructor, admitting that you don't possess all the knowledge and the immediate response to every single issue that's ever brought up, it just shows that you're human as well, and that you can relate with your students in that capacity.
Sorry, did you want to? Let me just add one thing on to Sarah's comment, which I really appreciate as well, and Helen's. I want to acknowledge one thing about that, and I said it's freedom in saying you don't know things. I want to acknowledge that that can be gendered, that can be there can be differences based on race and ethnicity and identity, and it might be easier for me as a male instructor to maintain authority in a class while saying I don't know and coming across as kind of showing weakness, right? Showing that I was wrong, than it can be for some of my female and colleagues with other identities and backgrounds. So I just want to acknowledge that, because it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and maybe some of you out there are as well. But I still tend to think it's the right way to go. Like bring it up the next class, email your class, post on Canvas about it, further reflection on the conversation. But I understand that there are other considerations and dynamics involved in those things as well. So
in one note there, I don't know if we actually, got to every part of your question, because I think it was multifaceted. But in a situation where a faculty member is not being responsive to alternative views or non-traditional ideas, right? Students have recourse, right, in that as well. So we can talk about that more, but if that's kind of part of what you were asking, I want to make sure to say that as well. we're about out of time, but I didn't give a warning, so I wanted to know if there's any last burning something or other that must be asked or said before we are done. One last thing. Okay.
Hi, I would just say we would do well to have this kind of dialogue with our new faculty when they onboard, and periodically, like we're doing now, and also with our students. We teach our students how to use their Buff One card and how to buy textbooks and register for classes, and maybe we're doing this in CU 101 and I just don't know it. But the how to use academic freedom is just as important as defining it as we are tonight.
Thank you. We're going to let that be the last word. That was a good summative comment. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you all for coming. Be safe, and hope we see you at the April event.